Why would a luxury store manager dare to slap a pregnant black woman in front of everyone? And why did he not know her husband was the most feared crime boss in the entire city? Amara Lewis entered the gold glass doors of Marcone Luxe Boutique with slow, careful steps, her hand resting on her baby bump as sunlight reflected off the crystal chandeliers above her head. She wore a simple blue maternity dress and flat shoes, nothing like the glamorous customers who usually filled the store, yet her eyes held a quiet strength that made people turn without knowing why. But Victor Marcone did not look at her strength. He only looked at her skin and her clothes and instantly decided she did not belong. Victor crossed his arms and stepped in front of her with a smirk, blocking her path like a guard dog marking territory. He spoke with a voice dripping with judgment, asking what she was doing there and why someone like her thought she could afford anything inside this store. Amara stayed calm, explaining she only wanted to buy a necklace for a very important occasion, but Victor laughed loudly as if she had told a joke meant only for him. He pointed her toward the exit and told her the store was not for people like her, each word cutting deeper than the last, each glance filled with open racism. A few customers watched but stayed silent, pretending to examine handbags while their eyes kept drifting back to the cruel scene unfolding. Amara tried again, telling him she was pregnant and just needed help finding something meaningful, but Victor stepped closer and slapped the bag out of her hand, accusing her of trying to steal when she reached down to pick it up. The sound echoed across the marble floor, and everyone froze, shocked but too afraid to speak. Amara felt her heart pound in her chest as her baby kicked inside her, fear mixing with anger as she whispered that he had no right to touch her. Victor stepped even closer, his face twisting with hatred, and before anyone could stop him, his hand struck her cheek in a sharp, brutal slap that made her stumble backward. Gasps filled the store as Amara held her face in disbelief, her eyes burning but her voice steady as she whispered the words Victor never expected to hear. She told him he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Victor laughed again, completely unaware that the gentle pregnant woman in front of him was the wife of Dante Marcone, the most feared crime boss in the city, a man whose anger could wipe entire businesses off the map overnight. Amara slowly turned toward the door, whispering that her husband would know everything, and the color drained from Victor's face, even though he did not yet understand why. And as Amara stepped outside into the daylight, the entire store felt colder, like something terrible had just been set in motion. If you want to see what happens next, hit subscribe and stay with this story because the biggest shock is still coming. Amara walked out of the luxury store slowly holding her stomach as the sting of Victor's slap burned across her cheek, and every step felt heavier than the last because she knew stress was dangerous for her child, and yet she also knew she could not hide this from Dante because Dante noticed everything, and the moment she stepped onto the sidewalk the world around her felt quieter, as if the city itself sensed something terrible had just happened, and she took a deep breath trying to stay composed while people stared, whispering, unsure whether to approach her or stay away, because fear and pity lived together in their eyes, and Amara raised her head, refusing to let the humiliation break her, even though she could still hear Victor's voice echoing in her ears, calling her names, judging her skin, assuming she was poor and unworthy. And as she reached the car door, her vision blurred slightly from the stress, but she steadied herself, determined to protect her baby and her dignity at the same time, and she gently placed hand on her stomach, whispering to the child inside that everything would be okay, even though she had no idea how this moment would end. And when she finally sat inside the car, nurse Evelyn Brooks hurried out of the store calling her name because she had witnessed the entire incident, and she was trembling with anger at the injustice, and she apologized repeatedly, telling Amara she would testify if needed, and that Victor's behavior was not only racist, but cruel, especially toward a pregnant woman. Amara thanked her softly because she knew Evelyn's voice might matter later, and then her phone buzzed, and she froze, because the name on the screen was the one man who should never hear her voice shaking, yet her voice was shaking. And she answered anyway, and Dante's deep, calm tone filled the car as he asked where she was, and she tried to sound normal, but he heard the tremor instantly, and he asked again more sharply this time, and she hesitated too long because Dante did not like hesitation, so he demanded an answer in a voice cold enough to freeze the air around her, and she whispered that she was fine just leaving the store, and he went silent for 3 terrifying seconds before asking why she was breathing like she was hurt, and that single question broke her composure because tears slipped out, and she tried to hide them, but Dante heard them, and his voice changed, instantly becoming something dark, dangerous, protective, because this was no longer her husband speaking. This was the crime boss the city feared. And he ordered her to tell him everything, and she said quietly that she would explain at home, trying to protect him from doing something violent. But Dante did not accept that, and he told her he was already on his way, and that no one on earth had the right to touch his wife, especially while she carried his child. And Amara's heart pounded, because she knew what Dante was capable of when anger was mixed with love and fear and loyalty, and she wished she could stop him, but she knew he could not be stopped. And as she looked out the car window, she saw Victor standing proudly inside the store, mocking her through the glass, thinking he had won, thinking she was just a helpless black woman who would walk away silently. And that thought ignited something inside Amara, a silent fire, a realization that this moment would change everything. And she whispered to her unborn child that justice was coming, and the city had no idea what storm was about to arrive. If this chapter shook your heart, then stay with me, because the real storm begins in the next chapter. So hit subscribe and keep watching, because the truth is about to explode even louder than Victor's arrogance. Amara stepped out of the hospital room carrying that silent fire in her eyes and her breath steady as steel, as she walked down the corridor, knowing that she was no longer just a pregnant woman who had been disrespected, but the wife of a man whose name could shake the entire city if she allowed it. And she placed her hand gently on her belly, whispering that justice would come not in anger, but in truth, because what Victor did was more than a slap. It was a reminder of how easily people like him judged her skin before her humanity. And as she reached the exit doors, she felt a shift inside her, a bold courage rising that she never needed until now. And when Nurse Evelyn saw her passing, she rushed to Amara's side with wide, worried eyes, confessing that she had already told hospital security everything she witnessed. And she promised she would stand with her if things escalated, because what Victor did was cruel and unacceptable. And Amara thanked her with a quiet nod before stepping outside into the cold daylight air that wrapped around her like a warning that this day was far from over. And at the curb, Dante's black SUV pulled up silently with his right-hand man, opening the door fast and respectfully as Amara climbed in with a calm face that hid the storm building inside her. And Dante turned from the back seat slowly, his jaw locked and his hands clenched together as he studied every bruise on her skin and every tremble in her breathing. And the second he whispered her name, the air in the SUV tightened with a deadly tension only a man capable of violence, yet driven by love, could create. And Amara told him everything with simple, quiet words, never once raising her voice, but each detail hitting Dante like a blade until his face went pale with controlled rage. And when she described how Victor slapped her, Dante looked out the window, as if imagining the man's final hour. But Amara placed her hand on his arm, reminding him that she did not want blood, she wanted justice, real justice, the kind that exposed Victor for the racist, greedy coward he was. And Dante breathed out a long, deep exhale, struggling between instinct and discipline, because his first desire was to burn the entire store down, but his love for Amara always overpowered his darkness. And he asked her what she wanted him to do, and she told him that the city needed to see the truth, not fear, and that Victor needed to face consequences, not death. And those words softened Dante's expression like only she could, and he nodded, slowly promising that whatever justice she chose, he would make it happen with his power, his influence, and his name. And as the SUV moved through the city, the streets seemed quieter, as if they sensed something massive was approaching. And Amara leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the weight of the day settle on her shoulders, knowing she was no longer a victim, but the beginning of a storm that would shake the luxury world, the racist world, and the arrogant world Victor Marcone lived in, because today was the day a pregnant black woman stood against power, money, and pride, and refused to bow again. And as the SUV turned toward their mansion, Amara opened her eyes with a new strength, whispering a promise to her child that they would be born in a world where their mother never let hate win. And this promise became the spark that would fuel everything that came next. And she told Dante that tomorrow the city would hear her voice, and no one would ever silence it again. So if you want to witness how justice rises from pain, then make sure you stay with this story and subscribe, because the storm is only beginning, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Dante that tomorrow the city would hear her voice, and no one would ever silence it. And as those words settled in the quiet room, Amara Lewis felt a strength rise inside her that even she had never known. And Dante watched her with a pride that softened every scar on his hardened face. And he gently placed his hand on her stomach, whispering that their child would enter a world where no one would dare raise a hand against its mother. and Amara nodded with a calm fire that felt like destiny rewriting itself. Real time. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting golden light across the Marcone estate, and Amara stepped out wearing a simple, elegant maternity dress. Her head held high, her steps steady, her presence powerful, without saying a word, and the guards fell silent as she passed, because even they felt that something historic was unfolding, and Dante walked beside her not as a feared crime boss today, but as a husband ready to burn down the world if she asked him to. Convoy of black cars rolled toward the luxury district, the same place where Victor Marcone once stood with arrogance dripping from his voice, and the media had already gathered, because nurse Evelyn Brooks had leaked the story to a journalist. She trusted, telling them that the city needed to know what had been done to a pregnant black woman who only wanted to shop in peace. And when Amara stepped out of the car, cameras flashed, and every reporter fell quiet because her calm, fierce expression spoke louder than any speech ever could, and she walked straight toward the store where everything began. Inside, Victor trembled as he saw the crowd forming outside, and when he heard the heavy footsteps of Dante's men, he felt the coldest fear of his life, because he finally understood that his racism had consequences bigger than he ever imagined, and he tried to hide behind employees, but no one wanted to stand with him now. Amara entered the store, and silence fell over the room like a command from heaven itself, and Victor opened his mouth to apologize, but she raised her hand, gently stopping him without saying a single word, and Dante stepped forward, towering over Victor with eyes full of lethal calm. But Amara took Dante's hand, quietly telling him with a soft touch that revenge was not her goal, justice was, and Victor's knees nearly buckled, because he realized that this woman he slapped, this woman he insulted, this woman he tried to humiliate, now had more power than he could ever dream of, and she didn't even need violence to destroy him. Amara then turned to the cameras that had followed her inside and spoke with a steady voice, telling the city that respect was not a luxury for the wealthy, but a basic right for every human being. And she said that no badge, no title, no store, and no skin color could ever define someone's worth, and the entire city listened, because her voice carried the kind of truth that shakes walls and exposes rot. Victor tried to defend himself, saying he didn't know who she was, but Amara stepped closer, her eyes unwavering, and told him that his apology meant nothing, because respect should never depend on who someone's husband is, and the room fell into absolute silence, because she was right and everyone knew it, and as she walked out the doors, reporters swarmed her, but she simply placed a hand on her stomach and smiled softly, as if telling her unborn child that the storm had passed and the world had changed little today, just because their mother refused to bow. Dante followed her out with a soft pride that lit his entire face, and Nurse Evelyn stood at the steps, tears in her eyes, because she had witnessed racism too many times, but had never seen it defeated so beautifully, so powerfully, and so peacefully, and the city roared with support as people online demanded justice, until the company announced Victor's immediate firing, and the owner publicly apologized to Amara, promising new training, stricter policies, and a full investigation into discrimination across all branches. That night, Amara sat beside Dante on their balcony, watching the city lights shimmer like tiny answers to her courage, and Dante wrapped his arm around her, whispering that she had changed the world for their child, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling peace instead of pain, strength instead of fear, victory instead of humiliation. And as she closed her eyes, she whispered to herself that the world was cruel, but she was stronger, and tomorrow she would continue to use her voice, because silence blesses injustice, and she would never be silent again. And so the story of a slap became the story of a revolution born from a mother's bravery, a husband's loyalty, a witness's truth, and a city that finally opened its eyes and changed, because one woman refused to accept disrespect ever again. If this ending touched your heart, drop a comment with the word RISE, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories just like this.